hopefully. The haunted house, or the scare attraction based on the Halloween franchise that was performed at Universal Studios Orlando throughout the Halloween season last year. So I'd ask you to, it's about 2 minutes long. It does have it does have some strobe lighting effects, and it does feature a series of jump scares. But just so that we all have a sort of similar notion of what I'm referring to as a scare attraction, there is an example of a scare attraction. If you just want to click on that and then watch through and then join back in a couple of minutes time, now that we've all seen a walkthrough version of a scare attraction. Okay, I'm going to assume that everybody's had a chance to have a look at that now. So that should hopefully explain a few of the pieces of terminology that I'm going to use. So scare attractions are usually referred to as walk-through events. That, as you see there, means in a very literal sense that you walk through them. One thing that's quite counterintuitive, however, is that they tend to be referred to as scare mazes. They're referred to as scare mazes usually if they're indoors. It doesn't have to have any kind of labyrinthine component. I've never quite been able to find out why they're referred to as scare mazes. I thought for a time it might be because of the history of using sort of corn mazes or outdoor mazes as one of the starting points for these events, but I've never managed to get that confirmed in any of my sources. So that's kind of one of the elements. It also should be able to demonstrate one of the ways in which audience members are sent through these walkthrough events. What you saw there with the Halloween event was what tends to be referred to as a conga line approach. It's fairly self-explanatory in that there is a single series of individuals and they're sent through en masse. That's the type that a lot of the theme parks tend to use because it sends through a lot of people very quickly. A contrast to that, a lot of scare attractions will also use what's referred to as a batch system, in which usually somewhere between 6 to 12 people go into the space altogether, and they are then, as a 6 to 12 people, shunted through either by the performers or just because of their progress walking through the scare attraction as 5 minutes, whatever, other batch of guests are shifted into the first scene, and then they themselves move along the scare attraction route. Those are kind of the most common ways of baseline audience relationship that exists in those attractions. So why do I think that scare attractions are important, or why do I think that they're relevant? Why is this nonsense, fun as it may be, something that I think is kind of interesting, that it contributes something distinct to Gothic study, and that kind of is relevant to the current moment? One thing is that they are hugely expanding in popularity. There was a huge boom in popularity of scare mazes, of scare attractions in the late 2000s and at the beginning of the 2010s. And it's still not really showing signs of slowing. It's still a huge booming industry that kind of came out of nowhere around 20 to 25 years ago when theme parks started to engage with these kinds of attractions. Madeline Holt was one of the first people to define what a scare attraction was, and I quite like elements of her definition here, but it comes in multiple components. I'm going to release that definition one element at a time. So firstly, we've got a venue designed to frighten its audience. She described at the start of her definition of what a scare attraction is, a venue designed to frighten its audience. So this is defined, therefore, in terms of its affective results on the spectator. So something that is aiming to create fear in the audience members. But there are two very different additions to this definition that Madeline adds to this. One is that it's a venue designed to frighten its audience And then she goes on to use an immersive theatre, essentially related definition. Site-specific performances featuring live actors, custom sets, sound, and lighting effects. So defining scare attractions, not just in terms of their intentions to create fear, but that they are located as site-specific performances and then discuss traits of immersive performance. And that gives us one sort of idea of what Holt is positioning as the opposite of a scare attraction, which I find is really interesting to consider when looking at what is this thing. Well, one thing that we can say that it's not is, okay, it's something that's designed to scare people, but that doesn't have those site-specific elements. So one is to define it as fundamentally immersive and sitting within, for instance, Adam Alston's definition here of immersive theatre, that scare attractions are not this. That means that scare attractions are not horror plays, like The Woman in Black, like The Haunting at Hill House. They are not horror films. They are not Grand Guignol. They are not one of the many stage productions of Dracula, all of which are based on a sat-down, observational, end-on theatre space for the most part. But what I find interesting on that, and almost slightly unsatisfying, is that a lot of horror theory, even to do with films, is increasingly arguing. For instance, Xavier Reyes's corporeal models of horror film spectatorship that require the spectator of horror to be active. That in many regards, watching horror, consuming horror is itself an active, strong agency-led activity. And so this kind of means that lines start to be blurred in, well, at what point does a horror event become participatory? At what point does it become immersive? Because, okay, I know that if I go through that Halloween attraction, Michael Myers has come out with a knife and stabbed me. But equally in The Woman in Black, which I'm sat down, I'm sitting down, I'm watching an observational piece of observational theatre. Nevertheless, I'm invited to imagine that The Woman in Black is not just in the space of the fictional characters, but The Woman in Black is invited to be in my space as well. And she is threatening me as much as she is threatening the characters in the room. So I think that that represents a really interesting boundary between, or lack of boundary between, where you bring in what a scare attraction is. I think there's an even more interesting one from my side of things when we get into Holt's second aspect of the definition. The term does not apply to sites that claim to be haunted by actual ghosts. Again, I like Holt's definition. I agree with this, that a fundamental aspect of a scare attraction is it is not claiming to be it's not a ghost tour. It's not going to a lighthouse or a building where something creepy happened, of which there are many that exist just in Edinburgh alone, and say this is a spooky tour. This is a tour that claims to be haunted by real ghosts. And this brings us to sort of two of the elements of scare attractions that I find to be really, really interesting, that crosses over, hopefully appropriately and thematically, with magic. And it relates to the area of authenticity. Last year, there was a pretty big book about authenticity released, significant, which was by Alice Sherwood, Authenticity, Reclaiming Reality in a Counterfeit Culture, it was called. And she starts off in that book identifying that magic is one of her favorite things. The book is based on the predication that falsehood dominates our current culture, dating apps creating counterfeit love interests, every news channel increasingly questioned. And Sherwood brings up the performance format of magicianship or legerdemain as an area in which she's been obsessed, because she uses the quote, "Magicians are the most honest people you'll ever meet. They tell you you're going to deceive you, and then they do," referring to effects and legerdemain rather than tricks or magic, since ultimately they're not tricking anybody about being dishonest, and no magic is being claimed to take place, at least not outside of the head of the spectator. that I think raises two interesting different versions of authenticity. A first authenticity of an objective, outward-facing and verifiable reality, but a second authenticity that is personal, subjective, inward-facing, invisible and unverifiable. And as the first form of authenticity is rescinded from view and prominence, arguably ever since modernist thought began to be replaced in discourse with postmodern thought, the second form, this personal authenticity, has become increasingly prominent in contemporary culture. And what both magic and scare attractions tend to emphasize or play upon is the fact that actually, despite this, our felt authenticity is extremely manipulable. And that's demonstrated by the different forms of doubles that one finds. Theatre has, I'm drawing upon Artaud here, of course, and like the idea of theatre and its double, that mimesis and non-mimesis exist. There's the naturalistic drama, and then it's double, the mirror that is reflecting back the reality of the world in which we live. But legerdemain and performance magic has its mirror version too, has its roots in reality, because while Sherwood spends time writing about and talking about magicians being honest people, and the idea of they tell you you're going to deceive people and then they do, well, what about the people who are deceiving people doing the same things but without telling you that they're deceiving you? And these are very real performance formats as well, performance formats that tend not to be studied very often: fortune telling, spiritualism, mediums, faith healing, that are performing the same role as the magician, as the legerdemain practitioner, but without playing on admitting that there is a falsehood going on. Ironically, scare attractions have this exact double. Scare attractions defined by that open falseness and the safety within the experience. As with magic, there is a kind of openly shared delusion, as opposed to ghost tours or spiritualism or mediums, where the idea is to sell a form of genuine delusion to an audience member in the equivalent of that mimetic, naturalistic play. So I think that scare attractions are really important or really interesting to study in these two areas, in the area of authenticity, because the body can be tricked just as cognitive processes can. Live horror performance has the interesting dichotomy, an authentic and inauthentic experience. They're inauthentic in that the threats of Michael Myers with a dagger here is obviously not a real threat. It's a simulated threat. And we go to these attractions knowing that this is a simulated threat. And yet the point is, the idea is to have us feel these responses as being authentic within the body. So we get this simultaneously authentic and inauthentic experience. The affective responses associated with horror, anxiety, fear, disgust, shock, and so on, these are legitimately real corporeal responses that are intended to be the effects of these performances. They play directly on the felt truth, as it were, of the body. Human bodies can react in real ways, and do react in real ways, to imagined threats. And the reason that I kind of throw identity in there as well is that this is a sensory stimulant going over and on and on and on and again as a series of threats to our bodily person, and our responses to those kinds of things are the sort of things that tell us, or that we might interpret as telling us, what kind of person, to use air quotes, we are. We might want to feel as though we respond in a certain way to a threat, but it then may turn out that our body betrays us, and instead we act in a different way. We might want to think of ourselves as being super brave. I want to be the person who walks through this and not get scared at all. and choose that form of spectatorship. And that form of spectatorship may get challenged as we go through that event. It may be that I want to perceive myself as a member of the group. And yet I might find that my personal responses are very different from the responses of the rest of the group. I may think this is really silly and stupid, and look at all these daft people in costumes, whereas the rest of my group are all jumping together as a collective activity. And so these moments of dissonance to do with who you are matched against the group that you're with, the person that you're with, who you yourself are, I think in this, you know, as goofy an environment as this may look, I think tells us a lot about, particularly given that it's booming in popularity, about the current environment in which we are. So that's kind of where I think that scare attractions are particularly interesting areas to look at. I'm gonna just describe a few more areas where I think this I'd like to put a flag in the ground. As we've seen there, we watched a walkthrough based on the film Halloween. Over the years, Halloween Horror Nights at Orlando has included scare areas that are based on the Purge films, Halloween films, Child's Play, Jeepers Creepers, The Walking Dead, several other franchises. And this has been the meat and drink of scare attractions for a very long time. Early in the history of scare attractions, scare mazes were absolutely dominated by major theme parks, by Universal Studios, by Knott's Berry Farm, one of the big parks in the US, by Busch Gardens, the Anheuser-Busch theme parks. And those theme park scare mazes tends to be overwhelmingly focused on existing film properties, the use of existing cultural knowledge that exists, that arriving at that particular environment with a shared understanding of what all of these elements are, contributing themselves to the story, allowing us to be an active participant. So that our experience, if we've watched the Halloween film, is probably going to be an awful lot more satisfying going through that walkthrough that we watched than somebody who doesn't really have a clue what is going on in that story because they have no frames of reference. There are places that play on copyright issues such as Passage del Terror that play on this even more so because they are not licensed to carry the characters and yet can still play tropes of the masked man, possessed girl that directly point at culturally understood franchises without breaking copyright. We've had a few elements of Michael Myers. Here we've got Michael Myers in a graduation environment. And this allows me to talk about scare attractions in a different way. The evolution of scare attractions away from the theme parks and towards other variants, what's referred to as in some yards as backyard haunts. And that literally the idea is that somebody's put them up in their backyard. Many scare attractions nowadays, such as, this is taken from the Facebook page of Lawson Chamber of Horrors in St. Louis, Missouri. Now this is an example of a scare attraction as a volunteer-run event. So not a big commercial theme park. This is predicated on hobbyism and, in this instance, charity. Lawson Chamber of Horrors funds 3 1,500 college scholarships in the town every year. Other events such as Farmageddon, Tully's Shocktoberfest, Scare Kingdom, all in the UK. These are located on farm parks and are partially marketed, or at least they were in their first year's operation, based on emphasizing local community, local business owning, the support for diversification of farms in the UK. Likewise, obviously, Lawson is marketed largely on this charitable status of the event. And so what we see is that lots of these events, once they spread away from the theme park origins, marketed themselves, and not just on being just about being the scary thing, come and be horrified, but also based on enrichment. Which also brings us to the Merlin Dungeon series, which early on in their existence, they've kind of dropped it now, really purported to be based on a kind of history edutainment link. They emphasize links to real and fictional local folklore. There are still traits of that and traces of that in their work, but but has shifted now towards being more overt, pure scare attractions. But it's that enrichment that I also find quite interesting, and it brings us on to the documentary Spookers. Again, I dropped this in the thing. It's the other I think piece of material that I'd like to have a look at altogether, because I think this shows a really good indication of the kind of environment that takes place outside of those big theme parks, and instead in what are referred to as backyard haunts, or haunts that run every year, scare attractions that run each Halloween. Spookers is a documentary and is about the culture of scare entertainment and scare performing. It is a New Zealand set documentary, and I would like to just drop in the trailer for Spookers now and just have a look at the trailer. Gives a pretty good indication of the content of the movie. Because it reflects a considerable amount of the sentiment that I've witnessed regularly throughout my time working in scare attractions, in both positive and negative lights. As you see there, and maybe I think watching that you see a little bit more of why I talk quite a bit about identity as being important in its relationship to scare attractions, because you get that sense. Firstly, we've got the word family being used, something that I've heard over and over again within scare attraction performers. And then that term, you can be whoever you want to be. We see there some elements of the subculture of horror performance that have similar dynamics in terms of the way that they operate as cosplay, steampunk, historical reenactment, or what are collectively termed ludic communities. But there is a pretty significant difference, which is that the labor involved in this hobby is compared to those things, it's more readily mechanized into a money-making machine, a money-making mechanism. And then there's the fact that we get those claims that are being made informally, and they're manifesting Spookers of kind of pseudo-therapeutic qualities. People talk, it attracts people who see themselves as other. And these pseudo-therapeutic qualities of working in haunts will involve facing fears, the ability to subvert societal and familial norms relating to taboos, gender, behavior. I mean, you see there in the trailer again, do you get to be, what would your family think if they knew that you were being a zombie bride? And so we get that sense of both potentially the positives and negatives of playing out. That on the one hand, yes, people are attracted to this thing, but on the other hand, it's a little bit the Wild West, and some of these claims about therapeutic elements don't necessarily hold up to scrutiny. There's something that is felt as this subjective authenticity as opposed to the objective authenticity. And secondly, the speed with which, or the ease with which, these dynamics can be marketed into, or mechanized into, money-making activities. Yes, at one end, you have the theme parks, and they tend to operate purely as cynical corporations and saying that you are working for us and you're just an employee. On the other side, we have our company in St. Louis that is, okay, everything's free, there's no charge, it's just a community, it's pay as you arrive. And that those sort of extremes of things can almost be perceived as less problematic, but that there is a big family, there's a big scope in the middle where there is a gray area of, okay, is this operating on volunteerism and hobbyism? And are we just giving performers the ability to do what they want and operate as a play community? Or are we mechanically making money out of them and using these therapeutic qualities or claims in order to get some cash and get some nice cheap labor, particularly given some of the very harsh working environments, if you were to think about it purely as an industrial environment, that scare attraction involves. I won't go into the list of that, but that, you know, working in the dark, working in extreme noise, working in constrained environments, it is a huge challenge. It is what would technically probably be classified as being extreme conditions. A next facet of scare attractions that fascinate me and that fascinate many, what's called the extreme scare attractions. This is a subgenre of scare attraction that sort of came about in about 2010, when people started asking for scarier, scarier, scarier. This you know, this algorithm where everybody wants something a bit more extreme this time, and then extreme scare attractions became well known in the public imagination, mostly I would say due to viral YouTube videos from one particular location known as McCamey Manor. I won't subject you to McCamey Manor imagery unless you want to go and have a look at it. You're welcome to. This is somebody who essentially runs a backyard haunt where one person will go at a time and be subjected to a series of horrific experiences. In terms of what an extreme scare attraction, which is a term readily used within the industry, actually is, it is difficult to put your finger on, because it's best described as a summary of kind of particular elements. And if you kind of have a certain threshold of particular things, then your attraction becomes an extreme scare attraction. So with a brief content warning, I'll kind of talk through some of the elements that can be included in an extreme scare attraction. I'll again preface this: some of these aren't very pleasant, but they are things for which there is a market. So I've tried to be exhaustive. So things that would likely cause an attraction to be called an extreme scare attraction: physical contact with the guest deliberately, physical maneuvering of a guest, restraint, being put into or onto transportable items that are then moved and carried, such as wheelchairs or gurneys, forced consumption of food or drink designed to elicit a disgust response, use of stress positions, verbal abuse of guests, including humiliation, swearing, sexual language, direct threats of non-consensual sex, use of terminology and tropes associated with mental ill health or mental disability, nudity, usually that of a performer. Guest nudity is rare. I have encountered it though. Scatological imagery or content, menstrual imagery or content, use of race, gender slash disability tropes and language that would generally be perceived as inappropriate, blindfolding and other forms of withholding or overwhelming senses. So again, this is something for which there became a pretty strong market around about the mid-2010s, and really starts to enhance that definition of scare attractions being something that's written on the body, something that's happening to you as people seeking affective experience as some form of validation. Katrina there fantastically has brought up the recreational fear lab and the studies that they've been doing, which is definitely very interesting. I've spoken to them quite a few times and quite a lot of interactions with them, and one of the interesting things that particularly something like extreme scare attractions brings up is the number of different strategies that people have. It's hard to categorize extreme scare attractions, but if there are two versions of them. There are the ones that are survival experiences. Can you get through again? They're rooted in a kind of psychological or taboo experience. Can you believe that they're doing this? Can you believe that you're doing this? And this, particularly with what's coming on in the recreational fear lab, brings up the idea of heterogeneous spectatorship and the multiple different ways in which which the audience member can engage in the content. Now, recreational fear lab around about 2019 or so were still defining kind of spectatorship of scare attractions in two different ways. Paradigms that have been used for quite a long time for horror, which is you maximize fear or you minimize fear. They term it in terms of white knucklers and adrenaline junkies. I want to be flanneristic, come and scare me, daddy, as it were, to use the term colloquial, if you will. Or I don't want to be scared. I'm here, but I don't want to be scared. as this strong binary, an interesting equivalence binary to the spectatorship of magicians being, okay, I'm going to pretend that I don't know that it's real, and I'm just going to be amazed, like flanneristically, at this, and yeah, oh, it is magic. Or alternatively, I'm going to try and figure out how you're doing this, or what are they doing? What are they doing? There's kind of this starting binary of approaches from an audience, but actually, I kind of argue for far more numbers of audience strategies than that. That within those and outside of those, there are significantly more audience strategies. Actually, I would say that Karina's playing with some of the ones in Magic. Darren Brown, perhaps best known for doing this, of playing, okay, you're going to try and figure out how I'm doing this trick. I'm now going to totally distract you by doing something else. Or in the case of Karina, by presenting and drawing on more specifically that kind of, that other form of magic, that other form of, okay, I'm going to act as though I'm a spiritualist medium, as if I am one of the kind of the charlatan group. But we all know that there's kind of an in gimmick here, but that allows me to tell a narrative and therefore obfuscate a little bit of when or where or how I'm going to do my illusions. In the case of spectatorship of scare attractions, this can come in the form of going to deliberately make fun of the performance, going to just look at the aesthetics of the costume and mask, going as a collector of experiences, going again to show how much you're not scared, going as a validation of your relationship within your group. Go with your date because it's, you know, it's a bit of a cathartic and gets the adrenaline going. And so it's a good thing to do on a date. And so we've all got these very different, multiple faceted reasons for going that perhaps goes beyond that initial recreational horror lab approach of, okay, you're there to maximize fear and you're there to minimize fear. So to me, just talking about fear, going right back to the start of Madeline Holt's definition, to me is not actually a sufficient paradigm to discuss horror spectatorship. The important dynamics include collecting, aesthetics, group dynamics, positioning, sense of subcultural self, cultural predisposition towards horror material, and so on. And so when we go right back to why do I think this is interesting, I think this is an interesting cultural clashing point. These very daft little events where an awful lot of dynamics that pertain to the cultural current condition bang into each other in a very playful and silly way that is both interesting and maybe a little bit cynical. That I'm going to go as far as that today. I think I've probably gone over my time a little bit, but and again, I know this has been a little bit of a whistle stop because I just want to signpost as many things to do with this area as possible, and because there are not many of us working in this field, almost send out a little beacon of invitation to that. There is a wealth of material here. Again, just, you know, I skirted over appropriation very quickly, but there is a world of, you know, screen to I was going to say stage, screen to maze analysis to be made. So thank you very much. I hope you've picked things out of my little patchwork, and I will hand back over to the Gothic team.